I think the best case for the resurrection is one that builds on facts which critics accept for two reasons. It's a common ground that we can both talk about as we did tonight. And secondly, we accept only evidences which are multiply attested for a lot of reasons. When you do go with those facts, you have to make a decision based on that data. And if the evidence seems to indicate that Jesus was raised, I think you have to be strict. I think you can be a skeptic. But I think there's a point at which you have to say, all the evidence we have is in its favor. None of the first century evidence is against. Then you narrow this list almost arbitrarily down to 4, 5, 6 facts. And these facts can disprove the naturalistic theories. These facts can show that Christ was raised from the dead, evidences. And you do it on this minimal basis. Tonight, I think we've shown, and he doesn't like most of the naturalistic theories, but even hallucination. I think there's serious problems with it. But here's what everybody agrees. Here's the bottom line. Every critic believes that the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus. So here's the issue. If the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus, and hallucinations don't work, as far as we know, nothing else works. All we have is this is an incredible event. There's got to be a time at which we say what they gave evidence to occurred, especially if this is a world where I can see God, prayer, healing, life after death, and now I'm saying this looks like the Son of God. And I do think the resurrection evidences who Jesus claimed to be. And back to my wife, I do think in 1995, 2,000 years later, the resurrection says if Jesus was raised, and he offered that to everybody else. I mean, I think when the disciples saw Jesus, they saw walking, talking, eternal life. I mean, that's just to bring it down to the lowest common denominator. They saw heaven walking on earth. And I think that allows me to say, someday I will be able to see my wife, and on the authority of the resurrection. Let me just end this way. Every ounce of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is evidence for my resurrection, if I believe.
One last thing before Tony talks, and that is, what is the message that Jesus gave? Let's assume for a moment that it's not just intellectual facts that we're trying to have people accept here. How would you illustrate the fact of what real belief is versus just the historical evidence?
Sure. I think your example of marriage is fantastic, and I think what Christianity is about is saying, I do to Jesus. You gather data about somebody. Nobody would suggest getting married in a vacuum. You learn facts about somebody, and then you exercise faith. You say, I do. You don't know if this is going to be a perfect marriage, but you have facts, and you say, I do. I think that's what the case is with Jesus. He's invited us to check him out, and there's a point at which you've got to say, I do or I don't. And the point at which you say, I do, is what Christianity is all about. It's not something, I mean, there's something mystical there, but I mean, for all intent and purposes, that's about as mystical as marriage is. I mean, we've got data to go on, and we make a decision. And all I can say is, after 10 years of skepticism myself, I'm not trying to stand up here and say I'm special, but I'm just saying God gave me a shot, and I said I do. God gave C.S. Lewis a shot, and he said I do. I think we can just make a decision based on the data, and not on data we don't have.
Tony, I just really appreciate you being here and coming all the way from England and your busy schedule, and give us your closing remarks. Summarize the evidence, because that's what we've been trying to go on.
Well, I think the most important thing I said was that what it is rational to do about any evidence depends on what you already believe with good reason. And therefore, what it is rational for people with the background of Jews at the time of the events in Jerusalem is very different from what it is rational for people from a completely different background of belief and knowledge.
But you would admit now, let's kind of summarize where we're at, is that hallucination theory needs a lot of work, doesn't it?
Oh yes, but this idea that it's something impossible about saying that it was a hallucination, if you believe that people had some experience, and they believed that they were seeing something, and you believe that the something wasn't there. This seems to me just what a hallucination is. I don't see... I mean, you may say that that sort of thing doesn't occur, but what I'm claiming, if I claim that people believed they saw something that wasn't there, I am just claiming that they had that sort of belief in something that wasn't there.
But if the data say these are the last people to see hallucinations, say Paul with conversion disorder, the disciples who saw Jesus in groups. In other words, if hallucination doesn't work, then what do you do?
Well, it does work with individual cases. And
right.
Therefore, you've got to...
So you have to have 500 individuals, or
no,
12
look
or 20.
This is the first mention of those 500.
Right.
And as this is the first evidence we have, it seems to me if there had really been a collective thing of 500 people, we'd have heard something about this in the Gospels.
But Paul predates the Gospels.
Yeah, exactly so.
We have it in Paul.
Yes, exactly so. And... If this really occurred, and Christians were talking about it, it's impossible to explain why the story is not repeated.
By the way, you have an appearance in Galilee with an unspecified number of people. You have an appearance in Jerusalem before the ascension with an unspecified number. Some people think those are one of the big groups, but we do know there were 12, and the Gospels say that too. So even 12 individual hallucinations would be incredible. It'd just be incredible. Hallucinations are rare.
Jesus called the shots ahead of time. He said in advance, I'm going up to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me, and then 3 days after that, after I've been in the grave, I'm coming forth again. Right, nobody believed him on both sides. You read the account, nobody believed him. He went up to Jerusalem. The religious leaders took him. He went through 7 trials. Monkey trials. He was crucified on a cross. A spear was put through his side. The blood and water came out. He was taken down off of the cross. He was pronounced dead. He was wrapped in cloth, the Jewish cloth, and inside every layer of the cloth they put spices to the tune of 75 pounds of spices, just like a mummy. Then they took that body all wrapped up and they put it into a tomb. And then they sealed the tomb. And Jesus was pronounced dead, and he was gone. And yet, just a few days later, those crazy disciples that had run when Jesus was crucified were standing in that very town that had watched him murdered, and they were saying, listen, Jesus is alive. He's the Messiah. You killed God's Messiah, and you need to accept Christ as your Savior. He's the one that God sent. And they believed him. To the tune of 3,000 at one meeting and 5,000 more in the same city at another meeting. How did they get away with that? Why did people believe? There are 2 facts that nobody can explain. One is the empty tomb. Empty tomb. They couldn't have been preaching that Jesus was alive if you could walk 2 blocks over to the tomb where he was buried and his body was still there, right? I mean, that would have been too easy to disprove. What happened to the body? What happened to the body? What do you think happened to the body? That is something that has to be explained. Something happened to the body, and we know that the body wasn't there. The tomb was empty. But just a few weeks later, the disciples were standing in the very city of Jerusalem, and they said, the answer to the riddle of what happened to the body is Jesus rose from the dead. He appeared to us. We believe it. We don't care if you kill us. Here we are. That's what changed the disciples. That's the only thing that makes logical sense. The second thing that you have to explain are the people that said that they saw Jesus alive after he was crucified. Paul says there were more than 500 people at one time that saw Jesus. In other accounts, you can find 10 different times that Jesus appeared to different people along the way. Now, what is the theory that accounts for what these people were saying? The main theory today of what was happening was hallucination. These people were hallucinating. That is, that they were imagining something as if they were seeing it, but there really wasn't anything there. They were just imagining it. Now, in group psychology and depth psychology today, we know a couple things about hallucinations. Number one, we know that if one person here is having a vision and the other person is having a vision, most likely they're not having the same vision at the same time. You don't have stereo vision. Okay? Because it comes out of your subconscious. It comes from your background. And so you're not going to have the same vision. Secondly, it is among people that expect it to take place. For example, if one of the accounts said that Peter and John and James were with Mary and the other women, and they were in this off the way home, little hut, and they had all the blinds shut, the door locked, and they were all sitting around, and it was dark inside there, and this is one of the places that Jesus hung out before, and the fact is, while they were sitting there, the candle was kind of glowing, and all of a sudden the wind kind of blew up, and the drapes went up, and the candle went out, and all of a sudden Mary says, I see Jesus, I see Jesus. Peter says, yeah, there he is. Now see, that would be a little bit of a problem for me, wouldn't it, for you? You see, they had to be expecting it. They had to be in one of those spots where Jesus was near and dear to them before. And if that was the case, then we'd have a big problem. Maybe they were hallucinating. But where did Jesus show up? Where did Jesus appear? It wasn't in those kind of places. It was on a busy road to the city of Emmaus. It was down at the beach in the morning. He had lunch with the guys a couple of times. He appeared on the top of a mountain to 500 people. The hallucinations took place in spots where hallucinations do not take place. Think of the 500 people that saw Jesus at one time. If those people were hallucinating, then you have to say there's such a thing as group hallucination. 500 people all tuned into the same vision. No. They were eyewitnesses, and this is what changed their life. Changed their life. What do you do with Paul, the old Saul of Tarsus? Saul was one of the Jewish authorities. He was the chief persecutor of the Christian movement. He was an extremely devout rabbi. He did not believe in this Messiah, Jesus, and he set about to kill his followers. According to Luke in Acts chapter 22, verse 4, Paul did the following. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as also the high priests and all the council can testify. That's the kind of guy he was. Something happened to him. And he turned from somebody that was persecuting and hunting Christians down and was adamantly against them. He changed from somebody that gave up the comforts of being a respected rabbi. He took the life of an itinerant preacher. It was a life full of toil, sacrifice, pressure, and unimaginable suffering. Paul, because of his change, was whipped 5 different times by the Jews, 39 lashes each time. The Romans also whipped him on 3 occasions. Once he was stoned and left for dead. 3 times he was shipwrecked. Once he was afloat in the water for 24 hours. Robbers were there to threaten him along the highway. Jewish and pagan adversaries were seeking to kill him. He experienced hardship. He went without food. He didn't sleep sometimes. He was poorly dressed. He had no place to stay. And eventually, he was martyred for his changed beliefs. He was one of the most remarkable men who ever lived. And it all began right around 35, 36 A.D. Why? Paul says the reason that he changed was he saw Jesus Christ alive on that road to Damascus. That's the only thing he says. That's what got him. All right, let me ask you a question. If I say the Bible is a spiritual book, does it mean that it's not a material thing?
No.
Well, could it be a spiritual body and still be a physical body?
Well, it might be the body of someone you would say was a spiritual person.
Here?
Yeah, he's exactly right. It's an ontological comment, not a behavioral comment. However, I think the issue here is Tony is looking at phrase spiritual body with 20th century empiricist or analytic eyes. And I think Paul has to describe what he means by spiritual body. And he's already said from Philippians 3, I'm a Pharisee, so I believe the resurrection of the body. 2, econostasis, out from among the dead ones. And 3, he calls it, he will change my vile body to be like his. Now there it's glorious body. It's not spiritual body in Philippians 3, 20, 21. It's glorious body. So now you've got body plus something else, you know, I suppose some kind of glory, but not less than a body. So maybe the problem is we're looking at this word spiritual with our 20th century eyes. But I guess here's the issue. If Paul is clear in Philippians 3 that this is not some wispy spirit, then we can't have the problem of saying, but this is non-physical, because he's telling us what he means by it. I take Philippians 3 to be a bit of a commentary on 1 Corinthians 15.
And this is, of course, we're entirely agreed, this is absolutely crucial about it.
That's right.
But unless there was something there that the television cameras could have picked up and all
That's
that,
right.
We don't have any reason for thinking that, other than if we already have reasons for believing that God's going to communicate with Paul.
You've got Philippians 3. You've got those 3 arguments in Philippians 3 that Paul thought this was a physical body.
Yeah, okay, he thought that.
That's
but,
right.
The fact that he thought that is not a reason
That's correct.
decisive for saying that it was there.
Yes, but I mean, when you said Paul believed in a spiritual, sort of almost a ghosty appearance of Jesus, Paul's very clear that what appeared is a body. So he must have thought he saw a body. And you still have if you like the Acts accounts, you still have his 3 companions falling down, seeing a light, and hearing a voice. And that's not conversion. Did you say, are you giving up the conversion disorder?
Okay, I'm quite happy to give it up.
Okay, good. I like that.
I've never really been devoted to this.
Okay.
I take it in camp. He gives me this psychology. The thing I want to maintain is that there wasn't anything there to be seen.
Well, if you don't use
how he came to have that, this is the business of psychologists, which thankfully I'm not one.
If it's not a conversion disorder, I'll just turn the question around to you. If it's not a conversion disorder, and he did not see Jesus, then what did he and his companions see? Why did they all fall down together? What happened on the way to Damascus? If it's not an hallucination, and it's not a resurrection, what is it?
If it wasn't visible to his companions, then it can't have been a physical body.
Who said it wasn't visible to the companions? I mean, they see a light, they fall down, they hear a voice.
That's all we're told
Let's
about.
put it this way.
They see a light fall
Philosophically, as you know, a contradiction. 2 things cannot both be and not be, same time, same place, same matter. We're told what they saw, but we're not told what they didn't see. There could have been a physical body standing right there. We're not told there was no body. The text nowhere says there was no body here. And then in Philippians 3, Paul says he's a body. The only data we have is Paul's, right? We don't have the companions.
Yeah.
We only have Paul's, and Paul seems to think it was a physical body. So at least, here's the problem. One of our 4 facts, Paul believes he saw an appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, if it's not an hallucination, where do we go?
This is what virtually all the people in the Gospels who saw the risen Christ seem to have thought. The only cases of them actually poking and so on and trying to see whether it was tangible are a very small group compared with all the others.
And I've got another one. What about Jesus' own family? Do you ever remember his family? I'm talking about his brothers now, not his mother. His own brothers did not believe in him during Jesus' lifetime, did they? What were they like? Mark 3:21. Just listen, you don't have to turn there. When his family heard about this, Jesus and his claims that he was God, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. Mark 3:21. John 7, 3 through 5. Jesus' brothers said to Jesus, "You ought to leave here and go to Judea." And they said this tongue-in-cheek, "so your disciples may see the miracles that you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret." Why did they want Jesus to go up to this area and do miracles? "Since you are doing these things, show yourselves to the world." And it says, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." Why did they want him to go up there? They were trying to goad him into a death trap. If he showed up at the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, they thought that the authorities would take him and kill him. And so they were saying, "Jesus, why don't you go on up to Jerusalem and do a few miracles up there and make a few statements up there?" And they would have been rid of him. Those were his brothers. Nice family, huh? Now, we don't hear very much about Jesus' brothers until Acts chapter verse 14. But surprise, surprise, these fellas that did not believe in Jesus and actually tried to kill him off show up in Acts chapter 1 verse 14, where it says, "They all joined together constantly in prayer," talking about the first Christians, "along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and, goodness sakes alive, his brothers." What were they doing there? These guys that tried to kill him off didn't believe in him. Why were they there right before Pentecost? In Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, Paul reports that when he visited Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, he did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, which seems to imply that James was now an apostle. The Jewish historian Josephus records that the Jews illegally and brutally stoned James to death for what? For his faith in Jesus Christ sometime around 60 AD. In 1 Corinthians 9:5, Paul mentions not only James, but Jesus' other brothers became believers. He says, do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife, as the other apostles, and what? And the brothers of the Lord? And Cephas? These guys got converted. What changed his own brothers from not believing in him to becoming apostles that went out and got killed for their brother? Paul says, in a nutshell, in 1 Corinthians 15:7, the reason why they got converted. After Jesus was seen to be murdered on a cross and crucified in front of all Jerusalem, after he was put into the grave, after he arose from the dead, after he started appearing to different ones, Paul makes this little crisp statement in 1 Corinthians 15:7, then he appeared to James. That must have been a meeting. How would you like to see your dead brother come back and say, I'm God, here I am? There's nothing else that you can attribute to these brothers of Jesus, why they would have changed, except what Paul said. They saw him after he arose from the dead, and they went out and served him, and they got martyred for doing it.
Gentlemen, this question is for Dr. Flew. Jesus clearly was a conundrum to the religious leaders of his day. They didn't understand him, they couldn't explain him, and they asked him repeatedly who he was. According to the Gospels, on many occasions, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. The basis of his claims were the miracles that he performed. He said on more than one occasion, if you don't believe me because of the words that I speak, then believe me because of the miracles that I perform. The miracles of Jesus are a recorded event for both secular and religious historians and writers. as is the performing of miracles on the part of the disciples in the name of Jesus. These miracles are also recorded events that Luke wrote about in Acts, the 2nd chapter, when he said this. Luke wrote, "Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know." Do you not agree that it would have been fatal to Luke's purposes of evangelism to point to these miracles and wonders and signs, as well as these well-known historical events that had occurred, quote-unquote, among you, unless he was confident that his readers had personally witnessed these supernatural events and that they would confirm these remarkable events to others? My question simply is this: if Jesus was not who he claimed to be, by what power did he perform such miracles? If his miracles were real, if he claimed to be the Son of God, should it not be unreasonable to believe that Jesus rose from the dead?
Tony, want to take a shot at that?
If he performed these miracles, then it would be not unreasonable, though. But in all this, if this is right, why didn't more people believe in this?
Well, I can give you a clear answer from my point of view and from the little reading that I've done. More people didn't believe in this because they were looking for a different kind of Messiah to come. The people in Jesus' day were looking for a Messiah that would save them from the tyranny of Rome. Jesus clearly made it plain to them that his kingdom was not of this earth. His kingdom was a heavenly kingdom. And a great deal transpired between the day that he rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey with the people of Jerusalem crying, "Hosanna," to a few days later when they crucified him. What caused them to go from people in mass who wanted to make him king to people in mass who cried, "Crucify him"? The answer, very simply, I believe, is found in the Scripture, and that is when the people understood that Jesus wasn't going to set up a kingdom on this earth, that he wasn't going to deliver them from the tyranny of Rome, they changed their cry from "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," to "Crucify him."
Yeah, the other way of asking the question would be is, you know, going back to our trial illustration, the question is not how many people didn't see the fellow pick up the gun and shoot the other guy. You know, the question is always how many guys saw him pick up the gun and shoot the other guy. And we keep coming back to this thing, you know, apart from Habermas's witnesses here, you got nothing. And it seems like he's got an awful lot. It's not what we don't have, it's what he's got that's awfully important here.
Well, it seems to me, Dr. Ankerberg, also that the claims of Jesus to be the Son of God, in his own words, were founded on the miracles that he performed. He said, "Believe me because of the works that I do." Forget what I'm saying. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the dead are raised to life. Believe me, if for no other reason than the works than you see. Those miracles are recorded facts by secular and religious historians and writers. By whose power has any man before or since done those? When Jesus allegedly died and allegedly was raised again, in whose name did his disciples again perform those miracles? Jesus, in the name of Jesus. So my point very simply is the Lord himself said, "I am who I claim to be by virtue of the works that you see me do." And if Jesus was able to perform those miracles, he clearly had to be the Son of God. And if therefore the Son of God, it should be no surprise to us that God would raise him from the dead, without regard to who saw him or didn't see him.
Take a shot at that, Gare. What do you think?
Well, I agree with your logic. I think the resurrection is a greater miracle than the others. But I think you're quoting, if I'm not mistaken, you're quoting Acts 2:22.
I am.
Because if you read the next two verses, Acts 2:22 says he's a man approved among you by the miracles he does. Next two verses, he died on the cross, God raised him from the dead. So Luke, Peter speaking there,
Yes.
Luke giving Peter's words, according to Luke, the supreme miracle was the resurrection, because his argument is miracles, death, resurrection.
I agree with you.
So I think Luke says the big one here is the resurrection. But people, of course, are believing all along. But I like John's point, too. What we have to deal with is the data we do have, not the data we don't have.
Any final words from you fellas?
I'm not letting you go, John. I'm waiting for an answer to that.
All right, Tony, talk to us here.
This is his stage, and he's not going to let you walk off it.
There's no debate over whether the miracles of Jesus took place. So by whose power did he perform those miracles? From the beginning of recorded time until now, in whose name other than the name of Jesus have miracles ever been performed? He had to be who he said he was, or he could not have done the works that he did. And therefore, if he was who he said he was, surely, as he said of himself, his Father would not leave him in the grave.
Yes, I think, granted the premises, this conclusion follows, yes.
So you agree, he was who he said he was?
Granted the premises, I would agree with that, yes. I just don't believe these miracles happened.
So the secular and religious writers who recorded them were seeing hallucinations of themselves. And Luke of himself, why would Luke write to the people who was making an attempt to evangelize people and convert people to Christianity? Why would he write to them and say, "Ye men of Jerusalem, you know this man Jesus of Nazareth, who's performed these miracles among you"? If Jesus had not performed those miracles among them, they would have said, "Who are you talking about? You're crazy. We never saw any miracles."
Well, didn't some of them?
No.
By the way, even the Jesus seminar today, the miracles of Jesus are in right now. And Marcus Borg gives 3 reasons for accepting Jesus' miracles. And one of them is the enemies couldn't do anything about it. The enemies admitted them. Marcus Borg, the co-founder of the Jesus seminar, he has a hard time with the supernatural element, but he believes that many of the things that the Gospels reported.
What do they do with the creeds, the critics that aren't evangelical Christians, but look at the creeds of Acts, say 1 through 5, 1 through 10, where Peter is preaching, and he's preaching to other eyewitnesses and pulling them in on that. What do the critics make of those
They struggle,
statements?
and they especially struggle with 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, Marcus Borg takes the 1 Corinthians account very seriously. He says, reading Paul in a straightforward manner, I have to assume he saw something. He definitely believed it was Jesus. I don't know what else to say. And in a couple places in the Gospels, he said, Jesus supposedly raised the dead. Now, this is the co-founder of the Jesus seminar. He said, Jesus supposedly raised the dead. He said, can I deny that? He said, most of my colleagues deny it. But he said, I don't think we can be quite so fast here. He said he was an extraordinary man, and I'm not sure what he did and what he couldn't do. That's Marcus Borg.
And didn't Charles Worth make a statement about Josephus lately at Princeton? Tell me about that.
Yeah, James Charlesworth of Princeton said that the Josephus account, from what we know from history, we can be as sure as any historical conclusion can warrant that Josephus referred to all these things, that the disciples, he believed he was Messiah, that disputed passage which includes the disciples believed he was raised from the dead.
So again,
good data.
Historical evidence that piles up. Anything else?
Well, I'm not wanting to be unkind, but I'm still looking for a direct answer. By whose power did Jesus perform those miracles? And if by the power of God, and if his words were true, believe me for the very works that you see me do, then he claimed to be, and in fact was, the Son of God.
Yes, well, I think if you believe in the miracles, this is a rational conclusion.
So in other words, it's possible to believe in secular and religious writings of historical events. On what basis do we have selective choice of what we believe from history? In other words, we want to believe in certain writers and certain historical accounts, but then there are other writers and their historical accounts that we dismiss as being unfathomable.
Well, basically, I don't believe in anyone's accounts of a miracle, period.
So no matter who wrote them or how often they wrote them,
I don't think you want to say that, Tony, do you?
No, this is in fact the methods of critical history. You try to discover what actually happened, guided by your best evidence as to what was probable and improbable, possible or impossible. And the miracles are things that you take to be impossible.
I would say this, I'm neither a scholar nor a theologian nor an attorney here this evening, but I would tell you from a legal perspective, and I would challenge an attorney to contradict this, the evidence as supported by those who were eyewitnesses to, forget the resurrection, the miracles alone, would be overwhelmingly enough to convict this man of the words that he spoke. In the 20th century, if he was being charged for murder, he'd be found guilty. Too many eyewitnesses, too many things that they saw. Too many miracles were performed. Too many people saw them. Too many people wrote about them, not all of which were religious, not all of which were believers, many of which were in fact secular people who didn't believe he was the Messiah, but clearly admitted to the miracles that they saw him perform. So it's not a question of whether I believe that they took place. It's a question of reading from historical fact the writings of those who said, I was there, I saw it, these things happened.
And Gary, what other evidence would you bring into this picture in terms of those that are naturalists that say there's got to be a naturalistic explanation? Tony doesn't seem to know how to explain this stuff. The evidence, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection that you've presented so far, but his concern is, hey, just in the ordinary experience of things, it couldn't happen. Now, what would you say to that?
Yeah, the other way I said, one is just overpowering evidence for the resurrection, but the other way to go after it is to say, this world admits other exceptions. Now, near-death experiences, to give you an example, would not be a miracle. However, if near-death experiences evidence an afterlife, Jesus' resurrection would still be unique, but if people are living after death, now that makes you take a whole new look at the resurrection. So my interest in near-death experiences is not the tens of thousands, if Gallup is right, almost 8 million Americans that have had near-death experiences. My interest is not the tunnels and the lights, because that could be temporal lobe, it could be lack of oxygen. To me, since 1972, I've collected almost 100 cases of near-death experiences where something evidential happens 2 blocks, or in some cases 2 miles away. Now, if I just give one example, this is a real recent one, but the medical doctor, a cardiologist, said in his Michael Sabom, in his 1982 book, Recollections of Death, A Medical Perspective, he said, when I wrote that book, we only had near-death experiences. Now we have post-death experiences. In his most recent book called Light and Death, he gives the case of a southern mother in her 30s who had a brain aneurysm. And they had to fly her out to Arizona for a special technique. And I'm given to believe, I mean, it seems like only one doctor in the world does this, but it took 30 doctors and technicians in the room. And what happens is he opened up her skull, and if the aneurysm is right there, you repair it. But if it goes down deep, they put into effect what they call Operation Standstill. And this is crazy because they basically killed their patient. Now, this lady went out to Arizona. He cut open her skull, went down and found this thing is way too deep. So they had to kill her. And what they did was cool her body temperature down to 59 degrees, get all the blood out of her head. They stopped her heart. They stopped her brain. These were stopped for hours. And he's doing his work, and to make a long story short, if you're interested in the end result, he got the vessel, he repaired it, and she is doing fine today. Okay. But what the interesting thing is, when in her testimony, when she heard the saw turn on, she said she was out of her body, and as it were, looking over his shoulder at the top of her head. Now, she's getting near to this point where they're going to kill her, and she gives 6 points of corroboration. And one of the things she says is, she said, I had this idea of a drill looking like a pizza cutter or something, but she said it looked like a pen with a little tiny, where'd you get that? And she said, you had a socket wrench next to you. And the medical doctor said, what do you mean socket wrench? And he's wanting her to give evidence. He said, well, there's this a box that sat open with all these interchangeable parts. He said, draw me a picture of the drill. She drew it. Draw me a picture of the socket set. She drew it. And then she tells things that went out of the room. They couldn't find her artery. They had to go to the other side. She identified which doctor made the decision, which doctor couldn't find the artery. It's in her medical report. But during the experience, and then they kill her. I mean, she's dead for 3 hours, and she has all these points of memory. And I could go on and give others, but in one other case, real briefly, a girl who was drowned. She was underwater for 19 minutes. She reported what her parents were doing at home that night, what her mom did for dinner, where her dad was sitting, a G.I. Joe that her brother played with, a doll that her sister played with. She talked about a popular song that came on the television, in the radio. And she gave this, she was no brain activity, comatose. She came to 3 days later, looked up and told the doctor, you're the one that resuscitated me, told him this big long story, and he checked the data from just 3 days earlier. Now, I think these are some hard cases, and there's dozens of others like them. Now, if this is true, and there's life after death, this isn't Jesus, but if there's life after death, it allows us to understand a model for what we call resurrection.
Tony?
This is supposed to show life after death, is it?
Well, I think, not extenuated life, not heaven, hell, but what I would argue is minimalistic life after death. By minimalistic life after death, I mean minutes, sometimes hours, minutes, after cessation of heart or brain waves. Now, to me, if a person's recording something, if it's in my medical report that I flatlined at 3:02, and I had no brain wave at 3:15, and I report something that happened a few minutes after that, or an hour later, and I can tell you what went on, say a police report, and it's after the event. No, I don't think life after death in the traditional view of heaven and hell, but in the sense of having data for minutes after death. And I would think life after hours of death would be tough for a naturalist.
All right, now, Gary, in your book, let's stop right there, and I'll give a plug to your book, The Historical Jesus, all right?
Okay.
You've got a whole chapter on how Tony's friends, other naturalists, shot themselves in the foot by proposing all kinds of different ideas for what happened to the body.
Right.
Roll through it quickly in 2 minutes, hit some of the high spots.
Well, we've talked about several. Some people say Jesus didn't die on the cross, although there's virtually no scholar out there who says that today. But if someone thinks Jesus didn't die on the cross, you've got the medical data, you've got to go with Paul, you have the extra biblical evidence, you've got the Gospels, you've got a lot of things. You asked him earlier, did the disciples lie? Of course, some people think, and he said no. Some people think the disciples stole the body and then lied about the appearances. Doesn't work because they were transformed, they died, most of them died for what they believed to be true. We've talked about hallucination, and that's an important theory because it's the one he holds. Some have said the whole thing is a legend, but the problem with the legend, one of the main problems is that you've got a man like Paul, that we have early data, and for legend theory to be true, you want to probably get that out of the hands of the eyewitnesses and removed a little bit past. I mean, for example, our two best biographies of Alexander the Great are not written for 3 to 4 centuries after Alexander. And it's after that time that mythology starts creeping in. Miraculous stories about Alexander, which, by the way, are post-Christian. They come after Christ. And he lived in the 4th century BC. So for legend, when you've got early eyewitnesses, that's a real problem. So I think this data can respond with 6 or 8 refutations of every naturalistic theory. But I think that's important because the one that's been on the table tonight is hallucination. And I think the empty tomb is one more huge problem because now Tony has to have 2 of these theories. He's got to have hallucination. Well, actually, he's got to have 3. He's got to have one kind of hallucination for Paul, one kind of hallucination for the disciples. That's what he chooses. And now he's got a problem with the body in the tomb. Now, he's right. Bodies vacate tombs for different reasons. However, he's got to have the body vacating the tomb happening simultaneously with the disciples seeing the appearances. And, of course, he's got Paul later. So now he's starting to pile up these theories. And I think the more improbable theories you have, you're going to have a highly probable...
Didn't he write an article on that somewhere along the line?
Somewhere.
No, I'm not... sorry. Look, I'm not offering a naturalistic account of what happened. I'm not trying... I don't think it's possible to offer any satisfactory naturalistic account of what...
Except the 2 hallucination theories.
But I do think hallucination covers a lot of the data, but I don't offer anything to cover the empty tomb evidence.
We're debating the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? And we're on this thing of what kind of resurrection happened. If you do say that Jesus came forth from the dead, what kind of body was there? Was it a spiritual body? What does that mean? Is it a physical body? What happened?
Well, and I was saying, I think this is crucial to talk about Paul here because everybody admits the Pauline data. Critic after critic says there's no eyewitness data except Paul. And so it's important to know what Paul thinks he saw on the way to Damascus. Now, I had said before that in 1 Corinthians 15, he could have chosen the word pneuma. He doesn't. He does say spiritual. He's got an adjective there, but he says soma, body. Philippians chapter 3, it's a short chapter, 21 verses, but Paul says three things in one chapter that indicates that he's talking about a physical resurrection. In the opening verses, he says, I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and as touching the law, he said, I was a Pharisee. Now, it's very well known that the Pharisees believed in a bodily resurrection. In fact, according to Acts chapter 23, as Paul was being taken captive by the Romans to prevent him getting killed, he shouted out to the group of people and he said, why are you taking me? Because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. He means a literal resurrection. And the Pharisees there said, there's nothing wrong with this guy, but the Sadducees don't like it. So as a Pharisee, he's agreeing with the Pharisees. So first evidence from Philippians 3, as a Pharisee, he believes in a physical resurrection. Secondly, in verse 11, he says that I may attain the resurrection of the dead. Now, the normal Greek word for resurrection is anastasis. But in this passage, Philippians 3:11, he puts a prefix on there, ek-anastasis. Ek-anastasis, according to all Greek scholars that I know of, they translate this passage as the out-resurrection from among the dead. Paul says that I want to attain the out-resurrection. Now, to a Jew, out-resurrection means what goes down is what comes up. You come out from the death. And then just a few verses later, Philippians 3:20 and 21, he says, we look from heaven for Jesus, who will change our vile soma, body, to be like unto his glorious soma, or body, when he should have said pneuma, according to this other view. So he's a Pharisee, physical resurrection, ek-anastasis, resurrection from out among the dead ones. And 3, he says he will change my body to be like his body. So right there in Philippians 3 alone, I think this picture of Paul, of Jesus being some wispy spirit that appeared to him in Damascus, doesn't fit Paul's own data.
Tony, you are just the most lovable person, and you're an empiricist. I mean, you got to follow the evidence. What do you do with this evidence?
Well, I find the idea of a spiritual body very peculiar, in that, after all, when you say something is spiritual, it's rather like saying it's immaterial. You're not, well, if you say it's immaterial, you're not telling us of any characteristic at all that you know of that it has. It seems to me that an immaterial substance is really nothing at all, and a spiritual body seems to me not to be a body at all.
Far more important than the small, careless historical errors scattered across the writings of Dawkins, Hitchens and Onfray are the significant misrepresentations of historical scholarship you'll find there. I'll offer just 3 examples. The first is one they're all guilty of. Several times in The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins gives the impression that Jesus' very existence is still a matter of dispute in historical scholarship. He writes, it is even possible to mount a serious, though not widely supported, historical case that Jesus never lived at all. And having sown this seed of doubt in the reader's mind, he later uses expressions such as, if he existed, or whoever wrote his script if he didn't. Christopher Hitchens likewise speaks of the highly questionable existence of Jesus. And Michel Onfray goes further, saying, Jesus' existence has not been historically established. We must leave it to lovers of impossible debates to decide on the question of Jesus' existence. These statements will seem utterly incredible to those who have dipped into historical Jesus studies. In fact, I read them out recently in a paper given to the Society for the Study of Early Christianity, part of Macquarie University's Ancient History Department. And the scholars and students in the room chuckled. And it wasn't the chuckling kind of audience. It is frankly laughable to suggest that even Jesus' existence is still a matter of dispute in scholarship. I know of no professional ancient historian or biblical historian in any university in the world who thinks Jesus' existence is still debatable. And just to check that it wasn't my own bias getting in the way, I recently asked 3 leading ancient historians if they knew of such a scholar. None did. Now, one of the 3 was Professor Graham Clark of the Australian National University. He is an eminent classicist and wrote the chapter on Christianity in volume 10 of the Cambridge Ancient History. He emailed back, "Frankly, I know of no ancient historian or biblical historian who would have a twinge of doubt about the existence of a Jesus Christ. The documentary evidence is simply overwhelming." If you're interested in the details of that documentary evidence, there are plenty of other videos and papers on this topic at publicchristianity.org. My point for now is that the new atheists have invented a scholarly debate that doesn't exist. All of which highlights something about the strategy of the new atheists, at least in historical matters. I can't tell if they do the same thing in other areas as well. They employ the arguments of marginal writers and present them to the public as part of the mainstream scholarly conversation. Now, I don't know if they do this deliberately, but they certainly do it. And Richard Dawkins proves the point. His one example of a serious historical case that Jesus never lived at all is one Professor G.A. Wells of the University of London, he tells us. What Richard Dawkins doesn't tell us is that George Wells is London University's Professor of German Language. Now, it's worth pausing to reflect on what Dawkins is doing here. He's co-opting a scholar from a completely unrelated discipline and using him to endorse something no scholar in the actual discipline would agree with. Imagine the response from Richard Dawkins if I were to argue at this point that it's possible to mount a serious scientific case that evolution by natural selection is false, and then cited a language professor as my authority. I suspect he would accuse me of intellectual dishonesty, or at least a gross ignorance of the field. So at this point I find myself asking, if in the one area I can check up on the new atheists, I find them significantly misrepresenting historical scholarship, how can I have confidence that they're not doing the same thing in the areas I can't easily verify, in philosophy, science, sociology, statistics, and so on? My final example of a significant historical misrepresentation in the new atheist literature comes from the pen of Michel Onfray. Bizarrely, he calls into question the crucifixion of Jesus. Another improbability, the crucifixion. History again bears witness. At that time, Jews were not crucified, but stoned to death. But let us concede that he was put on the cross. In that case, like all other such victims, he would have been left hanging there at the mercy of wild beasts. Then the remains were thrown into a common grave. In any case, there was no question of bodies being laid to rest in tombs. Fabrications. The claim that the crucified never received a proper burial is a simple exaggeration. There is very good first-century evidence in Philo and Josephus that some crucifixion victims, especially Jews, were buried. But more striking is the claim that Jesus' crucifixion itself is unlikely because Jews weren't crucified in this period, but stoned to death. This is an inexplicable blunder. Jews were amongst the most crucified people in antiquity. We know of 2,000 Jews crucified by Varus in 4 BC. 2 more, named James and Simon, were crucified in the late 40s AD. And 500 a day were crucified during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. We even have evidence of Jews crucifying Jews. Alexander Janus, the ruler and high priest of Jerusalem, crucified 800 Pharisees in one day, and their families were made to watch. But the clearest evidence of Onfray's error is the discovery in 1968 of archaeological remains of a crucified man in a Jewish tomb. Inside the burial box, which was inscribed Jehoanan, John, they found a heel bone with an 11-centimetre nail still in place. It's taught us quite a bit about crucifixion, not least that Jews were certainly crucified in the first century, and some were properly buried as well. That a noted professor of philosophy like Michel Onfray can so patently misrepresent history in service of his beliefs is, I think, very telling. These are by no means the only historical errors and misrepresentations in the new atheist literature. We might update this video from time to time, but here's the punchline for now. For all the learning and rhetorical brilliance of the new atheists, their commentary on Jesus and the New Testament reminds me that dogmatic skepticism can be every bit as blind as religious dogmatism. In fact, they're the mirror image of each other. I can respect Richard Dawkins, the biologist, Christopher Hitchens, the literati, and Michel Onfray, the philosopher. But there's no doubt in my mind that when these authors range outside their specialty, they are more than capable of sloppy reporting of information and significant misrepresentation if it furthers the atheist cause. As I said earlier, I can't get the thought out of my head. If in the one area I can really check up on the new atheists, I find them fudging facts and misrepresenting scholarship, how can I be confident they're not doing the same things in the areas I can't easily check, in their science, sociology, philosophy, statistics, and so on? Now, they might be accurate in these other fields, but I can't take them on trust. For me, that's a step of faith too far.